think we're going to actually vote on anything yet. So first thing I'll do is point out that this is an open meeting, open to anyone. The open meeting notice was posted on the state's website, and our agenda is as the agenda has been for the last several meetings, where we continue to work on proposed draft language and answer any questions, comments from committee members. So we'll go ahead and I'll just double check who I have here. Adam let me know that he was not going to make it today. I see we've got Mick on the call, we've got Helen on the call, and we've got Alex O'Brien on the call. I do not see Andy Johnson, John Omhafer, or Tony Lampman. Okay, they may join us later, and that's fine. So there's Tony, Anthony. Where we left things last time was we ended on the sampling procedure for dairy farm bulk tanks and talking about the use of the dipper. And we added the language that says that if the manufacturer has tank agitation recommendations that have been accepted by the department, the tank shall be agitated in the bulk milk weigher and sampler's presence for the length specified by the manufacturer. If the manufacturer has not specified agitation time, then we go back to our old existing language. 1,500 gallons shall be agitated for at least 5 minutes. Larger than 1,500 gallons shall be agitated for at least 10. Did anybody have any thoughts on that?
So I did have a chance to talk with our field rep here about, some of these things that we were discussing last meeting, in and amongst this agitation time.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that, we kind of bounced off each other was there is a milk equipment installer form where if an installer is going to install a new bulk tank, right, could that be added to the form there and put the onus on the installer, right, who purchased the tank for the patron to see if there is any required agitation time and provide that documentation? Otherwise, those manuals just get tossed aside.
Okay. I've got a note that if that language gets approved, then that's something we'll need to change as part of this process.
The other thing with that is just a question, I guess, and maybe your thoughts for those who are joining us today. So we have one farm that does have a silo, and whether they have a recommended agitation time or not, we did a verification and it does not blend the milk properly. So we choose to treat it as a direct load when we pick it up, and we'll agitate it at the plant, and then we'll pull the patron sample. So I'm not sure if there should be any type of language that the agitation time be verified.
Okay, so yeah, we've got to add an entire section here. Okay. So before we move on to that, anything else that we want to update with the system we're most familiar with, dairy farm bulk tanks where the sample can be collected? Otherwise, we're going to need to move on to two new technologies, which are sampling procedures for silos and then sampling procedures for inline samplers. And once we get to the inline samplers, we'll need to discuss, and I think we might want to split them out. Inline samplers as used on the farm as you're filling a tank, and inline samplers on the truck, because there will probably be two different sets of rules with regard to who can handle that equipment.
Sounds good, Laura. I'm fine with moving forward as you proposed.
And I see Andy joined us. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning.
So for a silo, bulk milk weigher and sampler shall collect the sample from a dairy farm silo. We need to change the word silo to after the contents have been thoroughly mixed to assure that the sample is representative. If the manufacturer has recommendations that have been accepted by the department, the silo shall be agitated in the bulk milk weigher's sampler's presence for the time specified by the manufacturer. If the silo manufacturer has not specified an agitation time, then we get into the, okay, now what do we do? So I'm going to take a bunch of that and bring it down here. Okay, and then go off of what Helen said. Okay, so sampling procedure. Bulk milk hauler and sampler shall collect a sample from the silo. Another one of those. After the silo contents have been thoroughly mixed to ensure the sample is representative. If the silo manufacturer has agitation recommendations that have been accepted by the department, the silo shall be agitated in the bulk McGuire sampler presence for the length of time specified by the manufacturer. If the bulk tank manufacturer has not specified agitation time, or the agitation time recommended by the manufacturer has not been found to be acceptable. Helen, does that deal with your concerns?
Yep, the sentence there, Laura, that says if the bulk tank manufacturer, should that be if the silo manufacturer?
Yep. Okay, we'll catch them all.
It-
There's a lot of them in there.
It's a work in progress.
Yep.
So Laura, way back up in definitions, when we defined what a bulk tank was, we said it included a silo. So we probably, if we're not going to, we probably want to, either we can make this little paragraph a sub-paragraph of the previous one for bulk tanks, or else we probably have to track back through the whole document and separate out silos. So it may be easier to do the first one of those two things to make this a kind of sub-paragraph. So say where the bulk tank is a silo, etc., etc.
That's already been done, I thought, because the previous one is for bulk tanks. Now we're moving on to sampling silos.
Yeah, perfect. I just didn't want to, because we've way back up in definitions, we've said a bulk tank can be a silo. We probably just want to be clear about that down here as well.
Okay. Okay. So going back to this, if the silo manufacturer has not specified an agitation time, or the agitation time recommended by the manufacturer has not been found to be acceptable, what options do we want to give a facility, a farm? And Helen, I heard yours, which is the milk shall be loaded onto the tank and sampled and legally sampled at the plant.
So I'm not that familiar with lots of silos, right? And I don't know through their process of making silos and installing on the farm, what their protocol is for the verification. We just found that the agitator was not powerful enough to properly mix the milk. So it's agitated. We put it on the truck. We bring it to the plant. We agitate for 10 minutes, and then we pull the sample, and that's what's going to be used for producer payment. Whether it's load 1, 2, 3, right? Everything is done the same for that milk coming out of that silo. Would you use the same logic, right, as a direct ship? Do you need to agitate it when it gets into the intake for
Yep.
proper, homogenization of that milk in the tanker?
This is Mick. My other concern about anything about sampling milk is on a perfect day, you walk in, the milk is sitting there cool at 38 degrees, and you agitate for 10 minutes or 20 or whatever time we say, and that is correct. If you come into the facility, whether you're a silo, a bulk tank, or anything, and that agitator is running and you say you have to agitate for 20 minutes, none of us, I think, are that not going to believe that people aren't just, well, it's been agitating, so I'm going to take the sample, or I'll give it another 5 minutes. How do you put something in writing with a time when there's so many variables, except if you're going to put 20 minutes, you got to stop the agitation, wait for the milk to settle, take the reading, and then agitate it for 20 minutes and do what you're supposed to do. It's just, how do you put that all in one rule? That's what I'm asking.
Laura, this is Alex. I could be wrong, and if anybody has thoughts, if there's older models or if the notion's not even anywhere near correct, but I thought that most of the silos that have been put up in the last several years are under constant agitation, because we've had some producers, and they might be choosing to run them at constant agitation, but I know of farms in Michigan, multiple farms, some very astute producers that did a lot of homework that said the sample is so much more properly agitated and correct that they actually got 0.2 improvement on their components on average in the year following the installation of the silos. And sorry, my laptop's, the audio's kind of.
What happens, Alex, then if somebody only has 1,000 or 1,500 pounds in their tank? I think if you agitated it for 24 hours, you'd end up with butter. I mean, just asking.
Sure.
Yeah,
I think, yeah.
Laura, is there a way of, what I'm thinking of is, so what we're looking for really here is the outcome. So we may not really mind how they achieve a representative sample, whether it is by constant agitation, whether it is by intermittent agitation, whether it is by making sure, taking that sample, as Helen's suggesting, at the plant. Your floor, I guess, should be that there is an ability to achieve a representative sample. So that's the outcome that we're looking to regulate for, if you like. So, there are technologies that can can achieve that sample without agitation. So I think one way or another, the facility has to have the capability of producing a representative sample. It may not be, though, by constant agitation. Or are we saying that, okay, well, it actually, so that's A, I'm saying, but so I guess we have a system that sits on a silo farm and can achieve a representative sample without anything other than gross agitation of that. So that's possible and that's verifiable with evidence. But in this section, are we covering that, or are we saying, no, that's an inline sampler? We're not talking about that. This section is just referring to where you don't have an inline sampler, you do have a silo, and therefore the farm needs to ensure that there is some way of homogenizing that milk at the time of collection for sampling, or if not, then the fail-safe is that that needs to be treated like a direct load and sampled at the plant, agitated and sampled at the plant.
This is Andy.
Completely agree with Helen on her concerns there.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to run this through the mind. I mean, we're working on the silo representation, and I'm trying to think of real life. Are we more looking for a representation of the milk that's pulled out of the silo? Because, you know, I think obviously a silo holds more than one load. I mean, I have a farm with a silo. It's, you know, then it becomes more like a single farm pickup.
Yeah.
I mean, if we agitate the milk, I don't see my farmer. I mean, how do you sample that milk coming out of there? I mean, there's not a lid on top where he goes up with a dipper.
Right.
You know, I know you want to have, and we want to have certain amount of agitation to have a proper appendix N run and all that. Because by the time, if you didn't agitate it, by the time you get to the end, there could potentially be way higher butterfat that doesn't fall into parameters and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, I think it gets sampled either, you know, as it comes out, or it gets sampled at the plant probably 100% of the time. And you want a representative sample of the milk that ends up on that load, because that's the one that you're going to run the appendix N and do the payment on with the weight from that load. And then what's left in the silo is going to get, you know, represented on another load.
Andy, does your farm have a sample port on that silo?
It does not. It has a 2-bay intake. They load it, and they actually have agitation at the mechanical agitation at the farm. So after it's loaded, they agitate the milk and then bring it to the plant, and then and that's where we or they sample it at the farm out of the truck, the top, and then they agitate it, and then they bring it to us, and then we pull a sample for appendix N, and then use their sample for payment. But they have it's not like a direct load. They have an actual intake that's licensed and inspected every 3 months or whatever them requirements are.
Okay, so listening to this and recognizing that there are multiple variables, what I added here was, if the silo manufacturer has not specified an agitation time, or the agitation time recommended by the manufacturer has not been found to be acceptable, there shall be an alternative sampling means that accurately represents the milk on the load. And just leave it to go to one of the other means that we've discussed.
And Laura,
Perfect.
can I ask on the word, sorry, Brandon, on the wording that you were suggesting there, when it says the agitation time recommended has not been found to be acceptable, who is who does the accepting or finding there?
Okay, maybe I need to add that, but I was going off of the fact that up here we said accepted by the department.
Okay, perfect.
So maybe I need to state that again, but I thought in the same paragraph.
No, I think that's fine. I'm wondering then, would the process in reality be, say Helen has that scenario that she's been talking about where she's observing that, okay, whatever agitation has been recommended here is not actually giving us the sample we need. What does she do then to trigger this clause? Does she go to you, or how does that work?
The way I've seen it work, and granted, I've not been out in the field for almost a decade now on farms and things like that, is that if there is no submission of data, then the assumption is there is nothing approved. It's only if you want approval, then you submit data and we, identify this as an approved system. Those of you that are out in the field, Helen, Mick, Andy, Lynn, JR, is that still how it's working? Is if you want something approved, you have to contact the department, but if it doesn't, if you don't need it approved, you just don't do anything?
I think if we can, if it's ever asked in an audit, if there's a question on whether it's meeting the requirement at the initial point, I think if you could reason to any of the, grading officers or the state people that you can show that somehow that milk is agitated and represented properly before the appendix N, which is the food safety part of it. Whether the payment one is right or not, I guess that's if the producer's okay with it and we're okay with it and trust each other, because I mean, with the guy that I have a silo, I could easily say, well, maybe we're going to pull a sample appendix N. We want to do the sample at the plant for payment. Well, now I'm kind of calling him a liar, but he's created some efficiencies for us because he's agitating, before he gets to the plant. So we don't have to agitate him 10 minutes. He's coming directly after agitate. I don't know. I mean, we don't, in the industry, the big scare word is always recall.
Mm-hmm.
If somehow something slips by, that would be catastrophic. So we analyze it enough where there's no way that sample's not going to be represented for an antibiotic or anything else, so.
And I agree with Andy. That's the main concern, is the back end of what could happen if the sample is compromised at all. In our co-op, we do not have any direct ship because we don't have the ability to agitate either at Kewaskum, or a couple of facilities we go to cannot take them. So everything we have goes into bulk tanks and gets agitated. So that there's a trust that's been there for years.
I think the way you have it written there, Laura, is perfectly acceptable. As far as, sampling from the silo, I mean, we didn't contact the department. We went, so what's approved methods, right?
Mm-hmm.
Direct ship, right? We know that's what we have is already approved. This is what fits best in the situation to get the most representative sample, right? From this farm, from this silo. And, as Andy and Tony have mentioned, right? You have that trust from the patron, right? That the plant's going to pay you properly, right? And they see all their test results, right? They can, You know, I mean, that's why we have field reps, right? They work with the patrons to make sure that, you know, we've got a partnership going and we're doing things the right way for both the patron and the dairy plant. You know, also the hauler too, right? I mean, it's got to be difficult for them going on the farms and then here's a silo. You know, what do I do? There has to be good direction, and I think that the dairy plant is doing that along with the patron.
This is Len, and I have zero experience with silos, none. But as I listen to you guys talk, it almost seems to me that if someone's putting in a silo, it needs to be part of the requirement that there's a plan for how it is going to be sampled and where it's going to be sampled. And I realize that's not part of our discussion today. That probably wouldn't go into Ag 82, but as I listen to you guys, I'm like, maybe that has to be written into some other chapter.
Well, I think that's where it goes back to the tank installation, right? The installer.
Yep.
So,
Well, another example, I mean, I have a farm that recently has a bulk tank, but then put in a bay to load all his milk and become a single farm pickup. Well, if you start looking at the definitions of what that bulk tank now becomes, it's probably the same as a silo. So what he's doing is using it as a cooling vessel or the storage vessel before I think it'd be the cooling vessel because that's what cools it before he loads it as a direct load. Well, then his bay and everything now has to meet the requirements of a direct load. You see where I'm going with that? I think the way you've got it, Laura, creates that opportunity to fall under another definition of, I think that's the direction we're going with this.
And I'm sure there are, I know this, the construction of this wording and so forth has to be has to take into account a multitude of situations that might exist and present,
Yeah.
ones that are already out there.
Yeah.
I just know from, the silos that we have people installing now or that have been installed recently, they're farms that are filling, they're usually putting two side by side, and they usually start with some 20,000 gallon silos, and they're farms that are start out filling them and then constantly filling them. Usually nobody's going to invest the, couple $100,000 to put those in. For if they think they're going to grow into them, usually they got the milk, and they're being used as the manufacturer intended and completely filled every day, sometimes multiple times. But they're just walking up to them with a aseptic, a little syringe and an aseptic port, and it's under constant agitation. They fill their sample bottle, and we like it because they never even have to open the bottle. So.
Okay. And as I've said in, I believe, pretty much every meeting, we're going to come back and look at all of this language again. So it sounds like we're comfortable with it now, but it might be 2 nights from now at 2 o'clock in the morning, you wake up and go, no, that doesn't work. So that moves us into sampling procedures for inline samplers. And And the reason I separate those out like that is the first discussion's going to be somewhat interesting. Up to this point, everybody we've identified who takes the sample, we've identified as they must be a bulk milk hauler, bulk milk hauler, weigher, and sampler. There has been a lot of discussion on the side as we have started to see some of the sampling devices go in on farms, that if you read the FDA documentation, it says that everyone who touches that inline sampler on the farm has to be a licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler. And the question has come up, if you've got someone who all they do is they take a bag with a syringe attached, they put the bag in the refrigerator, put the syringe in a hole in the septum inline, why does that person need to be a licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler? They're not weighing any milk. So let's open this discussion. Should those people be licensed? Who should be a licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler in the on-farm inline sampling process?
This is Lynn. I'll start this off. So I do not think that the person that marks the bag, puts it in the fridge, and puts the needle through the septum needs to be a weigher and sampler. I do think the person that agitates the bag and puts the sample into the vials does need to be a licensed weigher and sampler. And I'm very torn on the person transporting the sample to the intake. Well, it's a lot easier, and I don't want to say that person should be. I'm very torn on that part. Part of me would really like to say, because I'll be honest, we're putting in one of the Piper systems, it's going on one of our dairies. I would like to say that our driver, non-licensed weigher and sampler on a direct load, could just take that entire bag to the intake and let our licensed weighers and samplers at the intake divide it out into the sample bottles. Interested in hearing what everybody else thinks, though.
It's reminiscent for me of some situations we've had encountered in the past where we had to, at a very short notice, bring in third-party contractors to haul milk. They weren't licensed weigher samplers, and so we implemented chain of custody protection where we sealed coolers so that whoever the licensed person that does the agitating and the splitting of the sampling and the standard procedures prior to the samples being transported with the load, they also seal the driver's cooler. And so that was one way that we were able to satisfy the requirements and know that we weren't going to have any sample handling integrity issues.
Can I pose a question?
Absolutely.
So if you are licensed by the Department of Agriculture, right, you can also be reprimanded, right, by the Department of Agriculture, right?
Yes.
I hold a license. You can
Yes.
fine me, you can take it away, right? If I'm a farm employee and I'm in charge of putting the needle into the septum and making sure the bag's attached, and I decide to tamper with it, who are you going to hold accountable for incorrect sampling procedures, incorrect test results, whatever you want to call it? or given the person transporting it, correct?
Yep.
You know, farmer told me, oops, we had some high somatic cell cows. I'm going to stop at this farm and I'm going to replace the milk before I get to the dairy plant. At least if you're licensed, right, the department has some recourse for accountability.
So at Grassland, we have haulers that pick up bulk tank farms, multiple stop loads. That are 2.5 hours away. So what, I mean, there's trucking companies that have licensed weigher samplers, obviously, that are picking up this milk. When the milk is totally picked up and the back is sealed, the samples are all in there, the back is sealed. On several occasions, he'll have a different hauler bring the milk up to the plant just because it shortens the day for the weigher sampler that's actually picking up the milk. He has not taken any samples. He's never going to take any samples. He might just be a weekend guy that does something else during the week. I don't want to jeopardize that procedure by requiring that driver that brings up that load to now be required to have a weigher sampler. I mean, we have direct load drivers that don't have weigher samplers at all because the milk is weighed and sampled at the plant. I guess that's my only fear in this scenario.
Okay. So one of the things we discussed to answer Helen's question, one of the things we discussed internally within the department is those of you in Wisconsin are familiar with our drug residue screening site approval process, where there are approved industry supervisors who are responsible for the operation of their drug residue screening site. And if a non-approved, a person who is approved within the facility to do screening, but does not have that supervisory capacity, messes up, it is the supervisor who is responsible for what happened at their facility. We talked about, could we write something similar for sampling on farms, where the farms would need to have 1, 2, 3 licensed bulk milk weighers and samplers who would be responsible for the supervision of the sampling operations that happen at their facility, and that they maintain a list of people that are approved within their facility to do this, putting the needle into the septum. And if a sample is found to be tampered with, that it is the bulk milk weigher and sampler in charge at that farm who is responsible for that. It might require some changes in, we might need 2 different types of bulk milk weighers and samplers. And I don't know how well that would fly, because that would mean a another license type. But I'd like to hear industry's thoughts on that discussion concept.
How, and I know I'm going to ask this. How does this align with the PMO?
Okay, this is where we get into the other situation. Is, yes, if you read the PMO documents, they say everyone who touches this system must be a licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler. And we would, as a state, take an enforcement hit if we did not certify, license every person on the farm who touched the system. But
So at Grassland, because a lot of these farms, obviously, if they're going to have a silo, I'm going to put them on a single farm BTU. I mean, we can write what we want for statute in Wisconsin, but as an industry now participating in the IMS program, I'm going to go out there and tell them everybody that touches that sample needs a weigher sampler.
Yep.
So.
Yep. I understand that. So we did two things. First was we looked at our situation here in Wisconsin and said, if we did not license as a bulk milk weigher and sampler every person at a farm, what type of enforcement hit would that cause? And we just took what we figured might be a realistic number of 6 unlicensed, it's listed as unlicensed haulers, but 6 unlicensed people handling this equipment. And what we're seeing is a 1 to 3 point enforcement hit. So it is a significant enforcement hit, but it's not something that is not overcomable. The other thing is New York State is already doing this, where New York State does not require every worker on a farm who handles the sampling equipment to be licensed, to be a licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler. And they have not seen a significant increase in enforcement failures. They have seen a slight increase in enforcement failures. With all this being said, the person in charge of New York State's program is a gentleman by the name of Casey McHugh, who happens to be the chair of the executive board of the NCIMS conference. And I can very much bet that Casey and New York State will be putting forth some type of proposal for the 2025 conference that will change all of these rules. So this is where we need to get out the crystal ball. I think, and the other thing I think is, I think we don't depend upon New York writing their own proposal, but I think we also in Wisconsin write a proposal that says we think that the person inserting the needle into the septum just needs to be trained at the farm, does not need to be a licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler, but they need to be under the supervision of a licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler. So recognizing that this rule won't go into effect until probably sometime in 2025, what do we want to do here and now with this rule and our crystal ball?
I like your idea of putting that into our statutes, because I mean, this doesn't come around every 2 weeks that we're changing a statute to get out ahead of it. I mean, industry always has the opportunity to go above and beyond what the statute allows, correct?
Correct.
So, I mean, if we put this in, I mean, just because we participate in the IMS at Grassland doesn't mean Lynn's participating or anybody else is participating, and they can then follow that state rule and be in compliance. If I'm participating until that's changed, I have every right to go out and, you know, make it a requirement of that farm to have all their people have a bulk milk weigher sampler, but that's on me. That's not on anybody else. And then once, if I guess the big question, if that proposal at the conference is accepted, then at that time I could change my requirements of the farm, but then the farm is still in compliance with the state because we got out ahead of it. With that all said, I think I like the idea of having one person. I think, you know, it goes above and beyond just taking that sampling. There's also the way your samplers talk about sanitation of the sampling device, whether it's a dipper or a inline sampler or what have you, and that, or the aseptic sampling and blah blah blah. I think you have to have at least one on a farm, just so they understand the importance of all of that other stuff as well. So I mean, I'll lean on putting that verbiage in for the state, but knowingly, on my end of it, then I have just another requirement of anybody that ships with us. So.
Yeah, I think this technology has the potential to make a huge intake efficiency gains in our intakes. For us, we are 95% direct load. So now you take 15 minutes off of agitation of every load and think about what that does to our intakes. But also realizing that we're going to get all the Hispanic labor force on our dairies to be licensed weighers and samplers, that's a deal breaker. It's just not going to happen. If it's one person on the dairy, that's probably doable. But to get all Hispanic labor, it'll never happen.
Yeah, and Laura, just so I think we're moving in a really, really good direction here. But just, I guess some people will be more familiar with this type of technology, some people less familiar. But I think for the people who are less familiar with it, this technology has the ability to offer traceability about who is operating the system at a given time when a given sample is being taken, and to record all of the data really minute by minute as to who's interacting with that system, what the condition of the product is, what that sample is, and to barcode identify that. So even though it looks as though we're loosening the reins a little on knowing who's doing what on farm, the reality is that we have a much more granular picture using this technology of who in fact is handling that milk at a given time, and of how to tie that sample to that load, and how to understand what the conditions are on farm, for the wash before that load, for the temperature at every minute on that load. We're not becoming more lax in our understanding of how compliant or how hygienic the conditions were when this load was being composed. So I didn't want to jump in first here and give the advertorial before you guys had a chance to say how it might impact, but I did want to just put in at the end, for anyone who's worried about this technology, I'm happy to talk to Helen or to Mike offline if they would like to, and just explain to them and illustrate for them that the type of data that you can get to make everybody comfortable with the fact that if we move to this newer model, you will still have those assurances of understanding that all of the conditions are being met for having safe and clean milk entering the food chain.
I would just agree with Andy and Lynn, and just say to Lee's point, or really yes, I agree with you, Lee, but Laura, just giving you credit again for steering us this direction to just make it open, available. This is what we're doing. This is the direction it's going. So let's build it in a way that it allows for the future technology. So I think that this is all correct. Thank you.
I know we're working on 82 here, but if you have a farm which is licensed, right? So when you renew your dairy plant license, right, you can check your different cheese types and changes. Can you do that on a dairy farm license and say, okay, this dairy is going to have a silo. He's going to have, one licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler, and then trained individuals. And then, of course, inspectional staff and dairy plant field reps need to follow up. But you would have an identification of who's responsible, in this case, the dairy farm. And then he could then follow protocol, as you said, following the drug residue type scenario. where you have your trained, your licensed person, and then your trained personnel underneath.
Looking at 65, where we've got the dairy farm standards, I don't. Let's see, bulk tank, recording devices, milking procedures. I think we would need to write in that information into 82. I think somewhere we would need to put that language into here, because I don't see a real good place for it in 65. So it would probably need to come into here. That no person may do either of the following without a bulk milk wearer and sampler license. And that includes collect the samples for 6538. So we would probably need to modify this section. Okay. Too far. So I'll ask the next question. We've got some guidelines that we talked about. That it sounds, and I want to double check this. The person who sets up the bag should not need to be a bulk milk weigher and sampler. A person who agitates the bag and aliquots off a sample needs to be a bulk milk weigher and sampler. If the driver just takes the bag in total to the intake and the plant's bulk milk weigher and sampler takes the sample, does the driver need to be licensed? I believe we said no. And now I'm going to have to take things out of order. Each farm would need to have at least one licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler to oversee the use of the inline sampling devices. And then go back up here. If non-licensed personnel tampers with the sample, what recourse is there? The licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler overseeing the operation. We'll need to say that they shall follow all manufacturer's instructions for the use of the sampler. So if we get new sampling devices out there that use, who knows, some other technology to, I don't know, as in Star Trek, transport the milk sample into a vial, that we just say, if there's approved technology out there, you need to follow the manufacturer's instructions. And then right now in Wisconsin, we have a system where the dairy technical specialists go out and verify that each inline system is set up properly to take the proper amount of sample over the entire time of loading the device. Personally, from my view right now, I'm thinking, yeah, we still want that. The question is, will we need that? Do we think that is a good safeguard moving forward? And I guess I'll ask folks like Andy, who already has some of these out there. And I know we've just been in the infancy of that process. Has that process worked? Do you see value in that process?
I mean, if we're looking for verification or whatever, I think in the technology age, it also, I mean, it also, I don't know how, I mean, the appendix N's getting pulled at the plant. That's at our facility. As far as the payment purpose, I mean, I don't have any inlines. I did have one years ago in Minnesota. I mean, there was one person, the farmer's son, that hauled the milk. It was a 1 load a day. He had the weigher sampler's license in Minnesota.
Okay.
But I mean, are you asking how does the department verify that it's working correctly?
Go ahead.
What
I'm asking is, moving forward, we've been going to each farm and approving each inline sampling system to make sure that it is set up properly, that the pump is running at the right speed, that they have the right protocol set up for the particular type of unit they're using. As this grows more and more, do we see value in that type of approval process?
Laura, is the department doing that with the field rep?
Yes, I believe they are.
Then I would think that's a good process.
Right. And I think my analogy would be, you look at AMIs right now. I mean, initially you wanted, I'm struggling with the term. I mean, every one of them, you had to go out there and physically see that the block bleed blocks were all working. But as we've moved on, we've kind of went away from that, if I'm correct. I mean,
Correct.
You still have you have the requirements that you have to have all the written, the teat prep protocol and all that. You got to have all that on file. And, so if you go along that lines, I mean, if you initially approve a system, I mean, eventually, as we get more and more of them, I don't know if we have to go out and physically see each one working or whatever, but as long as you know that it was approved initially, or whatever that process was, the same as the AMIs, if it was a year, 2 years, or eventually, in my mind, the sanitarians out there, and yep, it's that system that was approved, so it's all good to go. If it's something new, yeah, I'm sure the department wants to do that initial verification and follow up on initially on all them systems to make sure that they didn't miss something in the initial approval. But I guess, like I say, if you look at food safety, the big one is antibiotics. And if we're doing an appendix N at the plant, the inline samplers, doing doing what it needs for pay. And obviously if it's not working, you're going to see some samples that don't align with other samples that's coming off that farm and all that kind of stuff, and it can be addressed. But
Well, this is Len. I guess I'm struggling a little bit to know how the inspectors would even know how the pump should be set. To me, that kind of comes from the manufacturer, that they should know the settings. So I guess I'm struggling a little bit to see how it's valuable to have you guys go out and do an approval process when it's put in. I sort of think that should fall to the manufacturer and the installer to make sure it's put in right. Now, I could see that when they go on their next regular inspection, that it might pay to look at it and even have a conversation with the producer about, how do you feel about the samples that are coming out of it? Are you getting accurate samples? But to make a special trip, I don't know that it's valuable.
Okay, so what I've put in here is the department have an approval process. That doesn't say we have to do the approval, but an approval process to assure the system is set up to pull the sample properly. This could include an approval process similar to what we have with the AMIs now, where once this concept reaches maturity, when AMIs first started to come in, technical specialists went out and checked the block blade blocks. But once the concept reached maturity, the process changed to where now the installer checks the block blade block and signs off on it. I think we could do a similar thing here. That, there needs to be a process, but it doesn't have to involve the department employees once this whole concept reaches maturity and people have an understanding of what the department wants to see in the way of safety protocols.
There is a form right now that has to be filled out for one of these too, right? A state
That
form
is
that have to
correct.
be submitted. Okay.
Yes.
I
And
guess
that state form comes from the FDA MAs with regard to the approval of these particular units.
I guess to continue the conversation of looking forward, I think we would really, if we could ever get to the point where we could trust that sample for an Appendix N, which is allowable.
Mm-hmm.
I think our requirement, or what we'd like to see a requirement, is that, we want to know that that thing was working the instant that milk was loaded onto that truck through the duration of the loading. And with technology, I'm sure a timestamp somewhere in the cloud or whatever, if we're going to use it for an Appendix N, how, that would help our comfort zone knowing that that's a representative sample of that load. So I don't know where I'm going with this, I guess, but that would create huge efficiencies at our plant as far as being able to wrap our mind around that. But I think that's a burden that should be put on, whether it's transporting or like you said, Star Trek stuff, or the technology that we're working on now. How do we gain that comfort zone to know that is a representative sample, other than putting on some sort of timestamp beginning to end and all that. I mean, we'd really like to get to that. We really would. And we have a couple farms that would really like to get to that, because when you're pulling multiple loads into a plant, you can save 10, 15 minutes per load. Obviously, it's going to create some really nice efficiencies, but unless you have that, I don't know. I mean, I know some people are accepting that and they can get to that trust level. We can't yet, but we'd like to. But I don't, like I said, that more of a comment than anything. But that, as far as pay purposes, well, we can look at those, the results and come up with the conclusion whether it was, done right or done wrong, or if it's acceptable for the whole load. But if we're going to pay them for that. But as far as the Appendix N part, that's where I guess we struggle with using that sample as it comes into the plant and not pulled out of the top of the tanker when it gets there. So.
Yeah, and that's, you know, I think about 30 years ago when the Appendix N program started and just how the process has evolved over time. And some of the things we did back then because we didn't trust the system, that now we understand the system when we trust the system better. I think this is another one of those that each company will need to do their own data collection to make their own determination. Do we trust this sample for Appendix N? And I expect that probably after, definitely after I retire, but probably not before I'm out of working for the dairy industry completely. We will see where a majority of facilities are accepting inline samples for Appendix N purposes. But this is a case of the proof is in the using.
Yeah, I agree, Laura. And, you know, the great thing about technology moving forward is that, you know, more and more you can move to an evidence-based decision on this. So it's not as if new technologies will come along and you'll be asked to, oh, well, just take our word for it. This works. This can produce a representative sample. You know, with each load that happens, you're building more and more evidence that offers people that assurance in reality that comes from milk pickups in the US, that's evidenced by the data, that's, you know, printed ticket on the farm, that's has the ability to be stored in the cloud. And all of these things are things that you can look at and you can make an evidence-based decision on as time goes on and we move forward. But I do think it will be important for us in the wording that we put in here to ensure that manufacturers are required to record that evidence, to produce that data, and that we don't take it for granted that, well, just because there's new technologies should be able to do this thing. So, you know, we like new technologies. We do want to make sure that we're putting that floor in there that puts the obligation on the manufacturers of the technology to, you know, to offer that evidence or to offer that comfort, the ability to offer that.
Okay, any other key items that we want to capture in the concept of approving inline samplers? And I don't think it does ever, is everyone able to see my screen? I guess I'll ask.
Yes.
Is there anyone who needs me to read the verbiage that's up there? Okay. Hearing none, what I will do is I will take these concepts. I will go back through this document at ATCP 65 and try to turn this into some legalese for the next meeting. Okay. And I would like to move on to the next one, because I think the next one will be a lot easier, which is truck mounted samplers. I think what we want to say here is must be a licensed bulk milkware and sampler. And they must follow the manufacturer's instructions for the unit they're using.
And do you want to put in an additional requirement there, Laura? I don't know if you do, to say that that the equipment must, that's some kind of requirement that means that the equipment has to produce a representative sample, because you're taking out the requirement for agitation effectively, or you're silent on it. So there needs to be, I would suggest, some kind of other way of ensuring that the sample is representative, or that you guys have approved this as a way of achieving a representative sample.
Okay, yep. Anything else we need to say on the truck mounted sampling devices?
I guess the only comment I would have is I think a truck mounted inline sampler for us is helping us. I could foresee where this is put on trucks, not just even for a silo or a direct load, but even for a multiple stop pickup.
Yes.
And then you could use that sample as, you know, as long as it's either has a seal on it or whatever, to prevent the bag or however the milk is sampled from having any sort of loss of custody. That if that truck came in to our plant, our weigher sampler at the plant would then break that seal, take that sample, and you could now use that for an Appendix N. I think that pushes us, or me at least, toward a better trust factor on using that sample for an Appendix N, and I could foresee where that would help create that efficiency that we're probably looking at. So I like this whole idea of it. It's just, you know, I don't know if you need to have verbiage in for that, but I could see where that's definitely going to be a possibility to do that. Like, just a comment.
There is, Laura, I know in the PMO, in the language that added for this, there's other language that talks about maintaining the sample at the correct temperature for the duration, and also ensuring the integrity of the sample, which I think refers to ensuring that, and this is a key point for multi-farm pickup, ensuring that there's no carryover from the sample on farm A to the sample on the subsequent farms. So I would suggest that might be a good place to start looking for legalese on this piece.
Yeah. Now, as far as the handling of the sample once it's taken, that is covered in a later part of this section, where we talk about the sample identification, that the bulk mill and sampler shall clearly identify the sample and shall care for the samples properly. So that is already covered. But yeah, we need to make sure that
Leah, how does your truck mounted sampler, what does it put the sample in? It doesn't use the bags like the farm ones does
Yeah.
it?
No, it doesn't. Well, actually, it can, but no, usually. So it takes two types of sample, Lynn. So one is a composite sample that represents a proportion of each farm on the load. So say if your farm gives 10% of the load, then you will put 10% of the sample that goes into what we call the load sample. And in Ireland, that load sample, which represents each farm on the load, is what we would use to clear for Appendix N equivalent. So that's one sampler that the truck has. There's another sampler, and that sample takes a representative sample from each farm. And that's so the load sample, sorry, just to go back for 1 second, the load sample we put into either a large bottle or vial or into one of the bags like you might see sometimes on a direct load farm. So then the other sampler is the farm sampler, and it takes a representative sample for each load, and we would use a vial like you guys use here. Originally, we had a vial that was a sealed vial that the needle and tube were attached to the lid of the vial. Now we've moved to using, for cost purposes and to kind of cost reduce that, and because it was impossible to get supply of those original vials, we've now moved to approving with the states where they're doing this using the same needle and tube into a septum that you would have on a direct load farm, but sampling into a regular sampling vial that's held within a environmental unit in the back of the container. So it's not sampling into open in the back of the truck. It's sampling into kind of a closed cabinet in the back of the truck, into a regular vial within that closed cabinet. I'm sure I've made that sound absolutely as clear as mud. It's very simple when you see it, Lynn.
So over here, like commingled haulers, they have to have a pilot sample. So do you guys have to bring in a pilot sample also besides your load sample?
Is that a temperature control sample?
Yeah, it's
Yes.
a temperature control.
Yeah. Yeah, so we would take that in the normal way at the first farm, or the other option we have is we actually have the ability to take duplicate samples. So some of the systems that we have out there will have a dual sampler. So they will have one sampler for the load, and then they will have another sampler which can take multiple identical samples at farms. So we can also use that. But generally, the hauler will just take a temperature control sample, either by just sticking a needle with a vial attached into the sampling line, or by taking the TC sample in the regular way. So
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what I've got for the truck mounted samplers is must be a licensed bulk milk weigher and sampler, must follow the manufacturer's instructions. Equipment must be shown to produce a representative sample or approved by the department, and the units are shown to prevent carryover from one farm to another on multi-farm loads.
Laura, we talked about weights in a whole nother section of this document, right? So that's already covered.
We do not talk about weights in any great detail because that falls under That falls under two other parts of the department. That falls under weights and measures for the approval of the measuring device. And it falls under trade and consumer protection for the verifying that each farm is getting paid properly for their load. So where we do talk about it is that we talk about that the bulk milk weigher and sampler is approved to weigh or measure the milk for payment purposes. And then,
So did we account for these systems that when they're taking a weight? Because your truck sampler and your on-farm system actually takes a weight, right, Leah?
Yes. Yeah, they're approved as legal for payment systems, legal for payment devices.
okay, so here's where we've got the section on measuring the milk. When measuring milk, before it is transferred, shall accurately measure the amount of milk. And then I believe we added language down here. When measuring at the farm or receiving facility using a department-approved inline measuring device, shall follow the manufacturer's instructions. When using a state-certified scale. So that is a good point because okay. So when measuring the milk at the farm, I think we agreed would apply to both the inline at the farm and the inline on the truck. So we did capture those new devices.
Okay, good.
Yeah, what we've said though, or Laura and Lynn, I think makes a good point there. So she's saying the bulk milk weigher and sampler shall follow all the manufacturer's requirements for the use of that device. So are we there for restricting, like when actually that individual, in the case of the inline on-farm systems, they have no impact on that measurement whatsoever, but effectively the wording we're doing here restricts the use of that device to a bulk milk weigher or sampler. So do we want to say that the person operating the system rather than, you know, we've said later on, well, actually that may not be a bulk milk weigher or sampler who's operating this system all the time. So do we want to restrict this here in this section about weights to only being a bulk milk weigher or sampler?
Right, on the truck mounted samplers, it would be, right? That's what we said.
would
If it's
be,
a truck
certainly,
mounted,
yeah.
it would be a weigher and sampler.
Yeah.
But on the direct load farm,
It may not.
right. But they can't really affect that either, right? It's built into your system. It's just going to print the receipt off and say, this is how much milk is in there.
Yeah.
But, right, we don't want to somehow limit that to have to be a bulk weigher and sampler that tears that receipt off or.
Yeah, well, I'm going to ask that question. I won't say we don't want that, but I'm saying, do we want that? Do we want it to be just a bulk milk weigher or sampler who can operate that system to measure the milk? And I think probably, Lynn, yeah, maybe we don't.
I mean, on these farms, you have tankers getting changed at all hours of the day and night. So again, then we're going to go back to, so if we have one licensed overseer at a farm, they're not going to be there in the middle of the night. And that milk may actually be leaving in the middle of the night too. So whoever tears that receipt off that has to go in with that sample is not necessarily going to be the weigher and sampler.
Okay, so yeah, we'll need to expand this language to say that, somehow to say that, it shall be the bulk milk weigher and sampler, or in the case of a farm system, the bulk milk weigher and sampler overseeing the operation shall assure that the device is being used properly and weights are being recorded. Anything else on the truck mounted samplers? Okay, so the last section is the sampling procedure at the intake. The individual shall collect the sample at the dairy plant where the shipment is first received. The individual collects the milk sample, shall verify the contents have been thoroughly mixed immediately prior to sampling to ensure the entire contents are homogeneous. Contents shall be mixed in a manner that is known to ensure homogeneity. I've got some concerns about that language because we know that when you take a big tanker and put an agitator in the center of that tank, you are not ensuring homogeneity of that entire tanker.
Laura, do you have any idea why that word was used instead of representative, like is used in a lot of other places?
Yes, the reason that language was used here is because if you are sampling a direct ship load or a single farm load and you are pulling the sample for the purposes of payment under the PMO says that the universal sample is the term that they used, that the universal sample that is pulled for that farm to pay that farm shall be taken from a tank that has reached homogeneity. And so we wrote this language in to match the PMO language, but at that time we were being very idealistic, I think. And I think time has shown us that this is not the reality for those direct ship loads. But I don't know how to handle that because the PMO still holds us to the standard that the universal sample taken for an individual patron shall be taken from a tank that has reached homogeneity.
Well, I think there's variation on FOSS machines. So when we run these, like if we took a sample out of a bulk tank that was agitated and then split it out and ran it across the same FOSS machine as two samples, we would have variation, right?
Yes. Yes,
So
and if you look at if you have the PowerPoint and if you look at the PowerPoint that I developed for how to determine when your agitation reaches an acceptable level, that's the exact standard deviation that I've referenced, is that your variation in the percent fat from one sample to the next shall reach a level where they are within plus or minus 0.10 to 0.15% of one another. And that is totally based on the variation that's allowed in the FOSS machines. So do
So-
we want to say that here?
Do you think that's going to get us in trouble with the PMO?
I'll answer that two ways. Could it get us into trouble with the PMO? Yes. Will it get us into trouble with the PMO? I don't believe any milk specialist would dig down into our rule to this level to say, your sampling procedure doesn't say you're reaching homogeneity. Your sampling procedure says they have to reach a representative sample. Because only a lab geek would recognize that difference.
Then I say we change it to representative.
But Laura, so Lynn, okay, how do I put this? What I would say is, have you ever had a ding for this, Laura? For
No.
the wording as it exists?
No. The only dings that we have had with regard to sampling from our milk specialist have been that when we did our first round of agitation studies, we did not start from an unagitated tank and pull a sample at 0 time. That's what he dinged us on, is that we did not show that at 0 time this tank was very striated and our agitation actually did something to the tank. That's the only ding we've ever taken on this.
And are you not opening yourself to a ding if you change the wording to representative where you're not open to that ding today?
Yes.
So, you know, the reality is that at the moment, this is a very high requirement for homogeneity before you pull a sample at the plant. And it may be very challenging in reality to agitate until you reach homogeneity. And it may not even be possible while still maintaining the quality of milk that you need to do what you need to do with it. So given that, you know, there are other ways to achieve this universal sample. And I think there are lots of technologies that will allow you to achieve a representative sample that don't require agitation to homogeneity. So I just wonder what you'd be achieving by changing this language to say representative, other than opening yourself to a ding that you're not currently open to. And I wonder if you might be, you know, if we're putting our future goggles on and we're saying, okay, well, in 5 years' time, where is all this going to be? I think with the efficiency pressures that are on your milk processing industry in Wisconsin, I foresee that less and less agitation will take place in the bays, and fewer people will want to do their sampling at receiving. And I just wonder, are you kind of putting are we being too technical, I guess, in trying to change this language to meet a reality which by the time this legislation comes into force may be a diminishing reality with sampling moving out of those bays?
I think I'm going to go back to something Andy said earlier today, which is one of the things we do need to remember is that this rule applies to not just grade A IMS listed milk, but this rule also applies to our grade B dairy plants, our cheese plants. And let's be honest, in Wisconsin, we make a lot more cheese than we do grade A fluid milks and grade A IMS listed products. So I'm not saying this is the right way to go, but I will ask the question, is it the right way to go to loosen this standard for the recognition of what our dairy industry is in Wisconsin and allow the facilities that are grade A IMS listed to meet the higher standard of the PMO?
I agree with that, Laura. And I think to expand on it just a little bit and bring it all full circle, you know, we do our best, right, to get it, whether it's representative or homogeneous. And if this ever came up on a survey, it's probably less of something that we can change to meet that PMO requirement. So if I'm looking at enforcement scores and things like that, as far as our facility goes, it's really easy to grab 2 points and get all the people at the farm to get a weigher sampler than to try to tackle this you know, yeah, you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we would risk the couple points on this topic as far as, you know, so we get a 98 instead of 100 because we're not, you know, they catch this or whatever. I'm okay with that because we're still above a 90. But if enforcement scores are at 90, 92, you know, because of this, obviously we're gonna try to gain all our points on anything that's more easily attainable. And to spend a day and get a bunch of weigher samplers is going to be way easier than to tackle, you know, in my mind, it's a hierarchy. If I know I can gain 2 points by spending a day at the farm versus, you know, trying to prove that every load that we take in is homogeneous versus representative, I'm going to go to the farm and get them points first and then just risk losing them couple points if it's caught. But in our mind, we feel very comfortable that we're taking a sample that's, you know, providing that food safety or that risk of having antibiotics in it and stuff like that. So I you know, whether it says homogeneous or representative, I mean, I think we need to show that we're trying to meet the PMO requirements, whether we do it or not. I don't know the right verbiage to allow that, but.
I want to bring up something else here that Andy talked about before, and in regards to the inline samplers and Appendix N. I'm not sure this is the right place, but Andy said they weren't comfortable with inline samplers and taking that sample for the Appendix N, and I feel the same way. I'm much more comfortable if we actually pull the Appendix N, but I also want to get away from the agitation. So I think Laura's going to disagree with me here. But I'm not sure that representative for payment purposes and representative for Appendix N are the same thing. For us, we run a CHARM SL3. CHARM says that their test is valid and accurate up to a 6.5% fat test. Over and above that, it won't flow. So again, not sure this is the right place, but Laura, you and I had this discussion, and you, I believe, told me that if we wanted to, we're using, let's just say, a sample that came in off the farm from a drip sampler, but we wanted to pull our appendix N at the plant, that we would have to show that that was a representative sample. Do we really need that same level of sample homogeneity, or however you say that, for an appendix N as we do for payment purposes?
No, you do not. For payment purposes, the PMO language says that the tank shall reach homogeneity before you pull the sample. For Appendix N, it says that the sample you pull must represent the milk that is on that tanker if that tanker were mixed to homogeneity. And so it doesn't say that the whole tanker needs to be mixed, but it does say that where you pull that sample needs to have a similar fat protein ratio as it would if you mix the entire load.
But then isn't that the same as saying it's representative? If you're going to say the fat and the protein and everything is similar, isn't that the same as saying it's equal? It's well mixed.
Yeah, I have problems with the PMO language of saying that this one needs to be homogeneous, but this one can just be representative. I have a problem with that language in the PMO. But
well, and then the PMO allows that QualiTrue side sampling port that you can take your sample out of there for your appendix N, right? And they say that's okay. How do you know that's a representative sample?
Again, they say that the tanker must be agitated before you use the QualiTrue side sampler. And that one, I am not sure how you get that portion of the tanker to homogeneity. I have not seen any testing to show me that any sample pulled from that side port on a tanker being agitated at a plant reaches even representative level.
Well, if you're going to agitate it anyway, what's the port? There's no point in the side sampling port. And my understanding was you didn't have to agitate it. You could take that sample when the tanker came in off the road without agitation. You don't think so?
Now, our former milk specialist, and I say former because he retired on December 31st, but our former milk specialist would not have accepted us pulling that sample out of that tanker without showing that tanker, that sample had reached some level of representative.
Laura, is it correct to say from stepping aside from this wording discussion for just a second that the bulk majority, the vast majority of direct fill tankers in this country are not agitated prior to sampling and receiving bays upon receipt? At least not the ones I've been familiar, and we don't have widespread issue with plants running their appendix N screens. The receiver has a job to do up there when they have to give that thing a pretty good stir with that dipper. And that's getting harder to get done because folks don't like to put the elbow grease into it, but and it's a little risky. You could take a cold dip if you're not strapped in, but most trucks aren't being agitated, right?
Actually, this survey was 3 years ago now, I want to say. We did a survey 3 years ago, and the states that we got back, I would say that 2/3 of them said that they were doing some type of agitation before pulling their appendix N sample at their intake. There are a couple of states that did not require agitation at that time. That may have changed over time as economic pressures have increased. I
Okay.
haven't done a survey recently.
And were those, last question is, were those respondents, were they just referencing agitation on direct fill loads, or was this, were they all loads coming in? What were you?
I believe the question was specific to direct fill loads.
Okay.
So these must be loads that are live unloading then that you're talking about that aren't agitating?
Is that for
Meaning
me?
Yeah, yes.
Live unloading.
As in pulling in off the road and coming into the intake bay, because like our loads are dropped. Our haulers drop. We have yard horses, so some of our direct ship loads could set out there in the parking lot for anywhere from an hour to 12 hours. So yes, we agitate every single direct ship load.
I'm with you. The drop yard scenario has just become so prevalent all across the whole country, really. And I'm just thinking like here in Ohio or Indiana, or I could probably come up with a handful of other states where I walk in bays and it could be a load that's been sitting there all night or a load that just came in. I have never personally been in a plant and witnessed truck agitation prior to sampling.
Yeah, and I think the key thing, Alex, there is that we're drawing a difference between the universal sample, which is for farmer payment, and the Appendix N sample. Because I think for the farmer payment sample, there's absolutely no way that you could get a representative sample just by pulling out of the top of an unagitated trailer. But where you've already taken the sample on the farm, just to clear that at the plant, I think, the missing link, I guess, between Lynn's position and Laura's position is that maybe the requirement should be that it's representative for the purposes of that test that's being done. So that it's representative in that the sample taken is within the range that the test that's being done to clear that sample for Appendix N can be effective.
To make that distinguishing, that's a fine suggestion. Certainly, if I was a farmer, I would advocate for every plant to pull payment samples off the top.
Okay, I hate to do this, but we are at 3 minutes to 11. So I need to, let's see, Max, do you remember, was this open meeting listed as 9 to 11, or was this open meeting listed as just starting at 9?
It should just be starting at 9. It should be open-ended.
Okay, so I won't run into trouble if we go a little past 11, but I do want to be respectful of your time. It's the universal sample and so we're going to come back to discuss all of this at the next meeting. I've got us starting with the inline sampling concepts. That brings up the first question, which is, are there any comments by the committee members?
I have one.
Okay.
So, I've got a grade B, cheese plant, right? So I'm really wondering if we aren't spending too much time on the word your homogeneity or whatever the heck it is. It means, right, of being similar, having the same uniform structure. We agitate 10 minutes, pull a sample. We've done agitation studies and we say, here's the time that we need using this agitator, right, at this, speed, RPMs, whatever you want to say. It gets us the most mixed sample if you want. Are we hung up on this one word that I don't think we have in our definitions what that means? I mean, it means being uniform. Yeah. Are we, you know what I mean? Are we just putting way too much into that word where you agitate, you make your load, right, as homogeneous or equal, uniform as you can, right? And you take your sample.
Yeah, and that's something that I'll work on language for this entire section before we meet again, and see if we can make this language a little more usable to our purposes. Other comments from the committee? Hearing none, I will ask the next question, which is, we are at January 9th. 2 weeks from now is January 23rd. We have been going every 2 weeks on Tuesday at 9 o'clock. Does January 23rd work for those of you on the committee?
It works for me.
This
Mick?
is Mick. This is Mick. I'm okay with that.
Alex O'Brien?
Sounds good.
Andy Johnson?
Yep, green light.
Okay. So we will meet again starting at 9 o'clock on Tuesday, January 23rd. Any last comments? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Nobody
motion.
wants to adjourn?
So motioned. So motioned.
And is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been motioned and seconded. All those in favor of adjourning for today signify by saying aye.
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 Okay, that's all of the committee members on the call. I thank you again for your participation. We are getting close. There's like 2 pages left, so we're getting there. And then what will happen is I will take all of these comments, go back, work with our legal people to put this into legal language, and then so you guys will get a bit of a break, and then we'll get together again once we get there to look at what the legal language says and make sure that the legal language did not change our intent. So thank you all very much. And for those of you in Wisconsin, stay safe with the snow.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye now. Bye.